So good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Benita Bettner. I am the Executive Director of the Corporate Program at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and it's my distinct pleasure this morning to welcome all of you here for this discussion on Brazil's moment in the spotlight. I think as many of you know, over the past decade, Brazil has posted very solid growth. Granted, it may not be as spectacular as what we've seen from India or China, but by many estimations, it's been healthier and more sustainable growth. Brazil also has weathered the current economic crisis relatively well, and it has a growing middle class that makes it an attractive consumer market. The question that remains unanswered is the role that Brazil will play in the global economy looking ahead and what that means for the United States. This morning, we're fortunate to have two experts to help answer that question. You have fuller bios on your seats, but I'd like to take a moment to briefly introduce them both. Dr. Paulo Vieira da Cunha is former Director of International Affairs at the Central Bank of Brazil and one of 3 Monetary Policy Committee members. Paulo was Brazil's representative at the G20 meeting of central bank governors and finance ministers until January of 2008. He also served as senior advisor to Joe Stiglitz when he was chief economist at the World Bank. Paulo is a leading expert on the economies of Latin America and is currently head of research at Tandem Global Partners. Mr. Luiz Mateus is group president at Illinois Tool Works. He is responsible for the company's industrial packaging business in the emerging markets of Latin America, China, India, Russia, and Eastern Europe. Luiz joined ITW in 1979 and has held positions in engineering and marketing. In 1991, he spearheaded ITW Signode's expansion into Latin America, which included setting up manufacturing and operations in Brazil and Mexico. I'd also like to take a moment to thank ITW and the Initiative on Global Markets at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business for their collaboration on this program. I think we all look forward to hearing Paulo's and Luiz's views on the prospects for Brazil's economy and the challenges that lie ahead. So with that, please join me in welcoming Luiz and Paulo.
Good morning. I guess I'm asked to go first. I'd like to thank Benita and the Chicago Council on Global Affairs for this opportunity to be here with you. It's really a pleasure, and I hope we have a lively interchange. I would like to use my 15 minutes really on I think 4 or 5 things. Which have to do with the crisis and how Brazil came out of the crisis. And of course, as all of you know, Brazil emerged from the crisis with its banking system intact, with a capacity to react to the crisis with counter-cyclical policy, and poised for a very sharp expansion in consumption, which is already taking place. So it's one of these unique economies, but not, as Benita was saying, perhaps not as spectacular as China, but certainly it has shown a resilience and a capacity to resist the shock, which surprised many people. And so the first question I like to sort of tackle very briefly is, where did this strength come from? And this will give me an opportunity to review some of the recent developments in the Brazilian economy. And I would say there are both positive aspects of the Brazilian economy that explain the resilience, but there are also some negative aspects of the Brazilian economy that explain the resilience. On the positive side, very quickly, let me list 6 issues, and we can then, if there is interest, go into more detail. I think the first point is that there is a structural break in policy making in Brazil. That structural break is 1999. Of course, there was an important measure in 1994, was the Real Plan, but in 1999 is when Brazil, after really 3 lost decades pretty much in macro management, settled into what John Taylor likes to call the new Holy Trinity. And the new Holy Trinity is a floating exchange rate system, a workable fiscal anchor, which in Brazil took the form of the fiscal responsibility law, which took many, many years to get approved, but it's a very effective tool. And finally, the inflation targeting regime, which has worked pretty well. And this tripod has resisted many, many challenges and a lot of volatility and come out well. And I think not only it has steered the economy in the right direction, but because it has resisted so much shocks, both political shocks and economic shocks, financial shocks, it's now kind of entrenched as an institutional aspect of the Brazilian economy, and the credibility that is associated with it is a very important aspect of this part. The second positive side is the decade of fiscal adjustment. I'll have a little bit more to say about the quality of this fiscal adjustment, but if you look at the period from 1998 to 2008, this was a period where the government was capable of delivering large primary surpluses. There was a sharp reduction in the debt to GDP ratio, the debt to GDP ratio that had been over 50% of GDP at the beginning of this process dropped to 35% of GDP in October 2008 when the crisis really hit Brazil. And there was an important change in the composition of that. Part of that we did at the central bank. But essentially, Brazil became a net creditor in foreign exchange. If before a devaluation of the currency would have a negative impact on the debt to GDP ratio because, of course, the nominal value of the debt would increase more than GDP, now it's exactly the opposite. So if you look actually in November, when the currency depreciated very sharply, the debt to GDP ratio in Brazil actually dropped. It increased subsequently very rapidly because of the government programs. But this virtuous circle is very important. In addition, the program of accumulation of reserves and liability management, of course, coupled with the management, the macro management, gave Brazil increasing ratings, reduction in spreads, so Brazil was really capable of shedding off what the literature calls the original sin, and that is Brazil is now capable of issuing external debt in reais, and it was capable of elongating the maturity structure of the debt and changing the composition of the debt. So this issue of fiscal dominance that was a threat to Brazil for many, many years, the idea that the debt to GDP ratio and the dynamics of the debt was so unstable that would render monetary policy useless, is now really no longer a concern at all. And in addition to that, because of all of this, I would say there are these stronger institutions, both at the central bank and in the supervisory agencies, and that was clearly shown in the financial sector. Of course, the Brazilian financial sector had gone through its own crisis post the Real program, and it took really 5 or 6 years to restructure the entire Brazilian banking sector, both the private and finally the public sector, which was a mess. But just at the end of the Cardoso administration, there was finally the recapitalization of Banco do Brasil, and so the PROER and PROES programs really delivered a very efficient, well-supervised, and well-run financial system that basically survived the crisis untouched. There was one aspect that, if we have time, I'll mention, but it was basically untouched. It's also important to remember that Brazil, and Luiz will mention this much more, he's part of it. Brazil has a very dynamic, active private sector, both domestic and foreign investors. And they were very capable of taking full advantage of the expansionary side of the cycle. So Brazil grew at very rapid rates in 2006, 2007, and in the beginning of 2008. Very large increase in investment, And this of course, allowed for a very sharp and very positive growth in employment and in real income, which fueled consumption. And so this was a strong hallmark of the Brazilian economy as the crisis hit. Finally, as a sixth element, I would mention the policy response, which was a very, for us that have been watching Brazil for decades, it was really a positive surprise and pleasant to see that finally policy could be counter-cyclical, because in Brazil, typically, given the dynamics of the debt and the dynamics of the exchange rate, crises were associated with monetary tightening, fiscal tightening, and a necessity of the government policy to be directed to restoring credibility rather than using the accomplished credibility to really do counter-cyclical measures. And this way, given a very buoyant tax regime, which is a legacy of the high inflation, revenues did decrease and decreased sharply, but less than GDP. And so the domestic aggregate demand was reasonably well protected, and the government entered into a very strong program of enlarging the safety net, targeted tax subsidies, and increased public investment that is delivering growth at the moment. And importantly, monetary policy, which had been on a tightening cycle given the shock from commodity prices and food prices in particular, was the central bank was able to cut the interest rate by 500 basis points. It's now at the lowest point in the historical record at 8.75. It reduced reserve requirements very sharply, particularly to protect the smaller and medium-sized banks. It, of course, sold a foreign exchange at a critical point, and reserves were on excess of 200 billion when the crisis came, so selling to $20 billion was nothing. And given its very strong credibility in monetary policy, it entered into a swap agreement with the US Fed, and this is really quite a historic thing, because the US Fed has had swap agreements with likes the Bank of England and the ECB, but not with the likes of the Banco Central do Brasil. So that was very good, and although the swap lines were never really used, it really gave credibility. Now, very quickly, some of the negative aspects that had to do with the crisis. I mean, the first thing is that Brazil was insulated because it's a large then closed economy. To that extent, is similar to the US. I mean, the share of trade and the share of foreign transactions in the Brazilian economy is less than 30% of GDP. So it's a very different situation than Chile, Singapore, Taiwan, or these economies where actually, in the case of Taiwan, the share of exports, imports, and all of foreign transactions is larger than total GDP. So, obviously these economies were buffeted by the forces immediately, but Brazil, because it's a big boat and it's a relatively closed boat, it didn't benefit from that. But the disadvantage of being a large closed economy, and I think again Luiz will mention some more of this, is that it has difficulties in keeping up with productivity, and in particularly total factor productivity in the Brazilian economy has been historically low. It also reduces domestic competition, which is probably the major force for low productivity growth in Brazil. Also on the negative side is fiscal policy, because if fiscal policy had a positive side, it had a negative side. The reality is that Brazil today has a very overblown public sector. It spends about 40 to 42% of GDP. And if you include directed credits, it spends more than 50% of GDP. So if you really want to compare Brazil, and this is what people are beginning to do now, it's more likely to compare it with Germany than to compare it with the United States. So it's becoming more and more a kind of European mold economy if you consider the role of the state in the economy. And in fact, the fiscal adjustment that was so important to make the Holy Trinity work was done entirely on the back of increased taxes. Public spending during the Cardoso administration increased at about 6% real terms throughout his period, I mean the period of fiscal adjustment, and it actually accelerated. I mean, the Lula administration did a fiscal adjustment in 2003, but since then, public spending has been growing at very rapid rates. Of course, during the crisis now, in this year, public spending is increasing at 14% in real terms, even as revenues are falling. So, you know, and it's one of these puzzling factors, because in Brazil, the tax burden increased by 10 percentage points of GDP in less than a decade, from about 26% to 36, 37%, and now 38, 39%. And there was no opposition to this. In fact, the only time the opposition began was when they were going to tax lawyers. And then, you know, the whole thing came about and they stopped increasing taxes. But so that is a surprising element. And with this, of course, you created a very strong public sector, but a difficult public sector. So where are we now? And I'm just finishing up, if I can take another 5 minutes. So we've had a very rapid recovery after a sudden drop in GDP in the fourth quarter and in the first quarter. A strong, very strong rebound in employment and consumption, particularly in retail sales. Retail sales are now growing at double digits. A strong rebound in exports, and by now China is Brazil's largest trading partner. Brazil's structure of exports is very diversified. It really, exports to the US are much less than a third. Then there are exports to the European Union, exports to the Mercosur, and now largely exports to Asia, particularly China. There is a widening of the current account deficit, but in fact, foreign direct investment, firms like Luiz's firms are overfinancing the current account deficit. So if the current account deficit is running at a rate of about $30 billion, foreign direct investment is running at $35 to $40 billion. On top of this, of course, our portfolio flows to take advantage of the recapitalizations and of the valuations in the Bovespa and so on. And so actually the currency is appreciating very rapidly. And at the same time, as I mentioned, there is now a very sharp deterioration in the fiscal outlook. So this makes domestic investors, and particularly the money managed funds in Brazil, the fundos mútuos, very nervous. So the yield curve is very steep because there is expectation that the central bank will start hiking pretty soon as perhaps the second or the latest third quarter of next year. And then there is the question that there are the elections in 2010, that there will be no fiscal adjustment in 2010, and therefore there will be kind of a difficult fiscal adjustment in 2011. So the yield curve is pricing in all of this, and of course that works against the recovery in investment. So you're having very much of a consumption-led growth. So the outlook, just to finalize, the outlook I would say is very positive. Potential GDP in Brazil did not drop, apparently, during the cycle. It's still possibly hovering at around 4% per annum. Inflation is under control. There is a need for fiscal adjustment. And this need is of a structural sort, not different than many other economies. I mean, the liabilities of the Social Security system are enormous, are larger than 100% of GDP. This hasn't been tackled, and there are a number of other issues. But I think that if one looks, and with this I conclude, at the legacy of the Lula administration, it has two major legacies, to my mind. One is the expansion of the safety net and really this incredible achievement of reducing poverty and bringing a whole group of new people to the middle classes, and this is, of course, behind the expansion in credit and so on. The other achievement, as I said, and which is a more dubious to my mind, is this transition to Brazil really as an economy with a large state. And nobody in Brazil that I know now is really seriously thinking of a model where you have an economy where the state share is about 25 to 30% of GDP, and it should be a small and lean and so on. Everybody, including very much the entrepreneurial classes, are very much used to this idea that just like Ken Rogoff says, the U.S. is becoming more like Europe. Well, Brazil is becoming much more like Europe. But the only problem is that Brazil is not Germany. It doesn't have the efficiency in the public sector and the efficiency, the level of productivity per worker and income per worker that can allow the inefficiencies in the public sector. So this question of how you're going to go forward with this very large state, very large and inefficient taxation and low levels of total factor productivity is, I think, an issue that will be revisited pretty soon. Thank you.
Paulo, it's going to be a tough presentation to follow. You really covered a lot of areas that we deal from a business perspective on a daily basis. But first, let me start by thanking the Chicago Council for inviting us here to discuss Brazil. Benita, thank you for your introduction. I don't know how many of you know about ITW. ITW is a multinational conglomerate of about 800 plus businesses. We manufacture industrial products, value-added products, and we are present in over 50 countries around the world. In Brazil, we have been operating since the early 70s, 75. I understand we started with one of our businesses to produce parts for Volkswagen. And today we have over 12 businesses in Brazil, and we employ over 500 people. And in particular, my group of businesses, which is the Industrial Packaging Group, has an operation that employs over 130 people, and we have investments in Brazil over $30 million. And we're looking at Brazil as a country that we first started to do business with from my group's standpoint by selling out of the United States as a distributor and selling direct to some customers. And slowly, we started to build some relationships and have a licensee in the mid-70s. In the early 90s, as Benita said, I started to spearhead the efforts of our group into Latin America, and we looked at a joint venture. Then we acquired our joint venture partner, and in the early 2000s, we built a plant outside Sao Paulo in Cabreúva, where today we manufactured products like steel strapping, plastic strapping, and some machines for the packaging industry. And from our group perspective, the packaging group perspective, it's an interesting position to look at Brazil because we service basically all segments of industry. So we tend to see a little bit of the steel industry, we tend to see a little bit of the lumber industry, manufactured goods, low-tech, high-tech. And from my perspective, going to Brazil since the early 90s, I've seen very, very large changes. And in the last couple of years, quite rapidly. In terms of modernization of industries, in terms of the level of income. I think Paulo alluded to the fact that the middle class is growing in Brazil, and that is fueling consumption and demand. I think that's one of the reasons that some of these industries are starting to modernize too. The middle class, as it grows, salaries become higher, and there is a need to modernize some of these industries and to maybe take out some of the inefficiencies that you can no longer afford. And as that happens, our group sees opportunities in the automation area where people used to do packaging by hand, and now maybe they require equipment, machines, and going forward, we see this trend continuing. And one of the areas of opportunity also is Brazil is a big exporter of commodities like steel, but in the future they're looking at doing more value added in Brazil, and there's some investments to build, instead of exporting iron ore, and build some steel plants, and in those areas there's opportunities for investment, for growth in our type of products. Now, as we operate in Brazil, some of the challenges that we've seen over the last few years include the high taxes that Paulo alluded to. And in the last couple of years, from my perspective, I see them going higher and higher. And you alluded about how also over the last 10 years, taxes have grown. Now, that high tax also creates sometimes an informal economy and maybe evasion. And some of the smaller companies tend to use that against the largest companies as a little bit of an advantage, because companies like ITW really pay all the taxes. And when you're talking about value-added taxes of 18–20%, there seems to be some people that still get away with being on the informal economy. Now, I think that as Brazil modernizes and a lot of the transactions are computerized, it's more and more difficult for people to really operate in that economy. And what we see is people trying to come back to the formal economy and get away from the informal economy. The other portion, again, related to the tax system is the complexity of taxes. Brazil is probably the country that we operate in that I think has the most complex tax system. I still can't figure it out. Every state has a different tax, and not only do they have a different tax, but if you ship from one state to the other one, it's a different tax. So the combination and permutations are enormous. And this really creates an administrative burden on companies like ours, where we have to have groups of people administering this, and not only administering the tax complexity, but staying informed of the changes, because then there's a lot of changes that happen, and if you are not on top of it, then you're not in compliance, and the government officials are looking for any little thing to find a way to fine you or look for a way to create a difficulty for the business. Now, as Brazil has modernized, as the exchange rate has gotten stronger, one of the issues that companies like ours see is that we start seeing that Brazil starts to become a high-cost country, the high-cost inputs. So when you look at labor, for example, in our company, labor, if you pay a worker 100, the cost to the company is 150. So you tend to look at your minimum salary, and you say, okay, this is the cost if I have 20, 50 employees. Well, that's not the cost. That's 50% more related to what they call the encargos sociais, which is really taxes that you pay on behalf of the worker for the government. You look at, for example, the paternalistic laws, labor laws that Brazil has. And if you're going to have to readjust your workforce, or you have to right-size your company, it makes it very costly to do that. If you have agents that have been selling for you and maybe very inefficiently over 10, 20 years, to really get rid of an agent costs a lot of money because of the formulas that the government has in order to provide severance to them. And if you just look at the increases, how Brazil manages salary increases, it's something that really gets out of control of the companies. In the case of our specific operation, 2009 was not a great year, because initially, as Paulo alluded, it was a slow quarter. And some of the industries that we serve, like the steel industry, were operating at 50% of capacity. So for our business, it was a slow year. And a lot of people were way below their results in 2008. Now, the unions wanted a 6.5% increase. So it's disconnected between the increases that the unions are looking for and the actual business results. Now, if they don't get this increase, then they start threatening with the walkouts. And companies that had the cash ended up settling with the unions, but companies that didn't are going out on strike as we speak. So I think that those paternalistic laws make it a little difficult sometimes for businesses to keep their costs down. And then when the union itself agrees to a salary increase, the government mandates that all the companies that are under that union actually implement that increase. So it's something that takes the cost negotiation away from the company itself. Exchange rate. Paulo alluded to the exchange rate. Brazil's exchange rate is getting stronger and stronger. When we first set up the operation in Brazil, and by the way, ITW invests in different countries around the world, not as an export platform, but to basically grow the business in that particular country. So we invested in Brazil to grow our business in Brazil. 80% was for Brazil, for the Brazilian market. Maybe 20% was for exports into Mercosur. Now, 20% still a significant amount of production for that plant that we have outside Cabreúva. Today, with the exchange rate, those exports become more and more difficult to Argentina, to Uruguay. And today, when I look at our cost to export from Brazil to Argentina and from the US to Argentina, it's becoming more efficient for us to export from the US to Argentina than it is to export from Brazil to Argentina, even though they're right next door to each other. And that relates to the costs of not only labor, but electricity costs are high, and the raw materials are high because government has duties to insulate some companies that have local production, and the steel mills have been able to lobby with the government on duties on steel, which is one of our raw materials. So when you look at our cost of steel in Brazil compared to maybe the world prices, in Brazil we pay a premium, which all becomes part of the Brazil cost. And then when you look also at areas like the amount of bureaucracy required to operate in Brazil, it also adds burden to the industry and to administer in a company. For example, when you ship a product from our plant to a customer, we have to generate several pieces of paperwork that have to go with the truck, and the trucker has to carry it. And if you are going to later on ship it from a distributor, then you have to change that piece of paperwork, so you cannot ship direct to a customer and then maybe a distributor can somehow take credit for that revenue. They actually have to go to the distributor or to one of our other subsidiaries in order to go to the customer and change paperwork, which makes it more complex to operate. Now, I think Dr. Vieira alluded that this is not all bad for everybody, and I think in Brazil the people that are doing very well are the attorneys and the accountants, because I know we use them quite a bit to resolve some of these issues. But the good news is I've seen Brazil making progress on a lot of fronts over the 15 plus years that I've been operating there. And the industries are modernizing, and industries are really becoming more Western, maybe more European than they used to be. Infrastructure still needs some work, and I think going forward with the Olympics and the World Cup, there will be investments in infrastructure. So companies like us with different business units will have opportunities not only on the packaging side, but in many of our other business units will have opportunities to grow with the companies that produce products for infrastructure. We are looking also at a wide range of industries that are going to benefit as the middle class starts becoming more affluent and they start spending. And as a company that produces packaging for a wide range of industries, this is something also that presents an opportunity for us. I mentioned about automation, which we are looking at doing at many customers. And I think that hits the area of productivity that Dr. Vieira alluded to. As the economy starts to become more difficult and salaries are higher, people are starting to look at cutting costs, and automation is part of that process. The economy is growing. I think this year, we initially thought that it was going to be a really bad year. Brazil seems to be coming out maybe at 0 or maybe a little higher, as Dr. Vieira alluded. I actually had not heard the higher number. Going forward, it looks like it's one that it's going to grow probably the fastest in the BRIC. Now, as Dr. Vieira and Benita alluded, some other ones like China are a lot bigger, but still Brazil is one that's going to be growing fairly fast. Exports continue to grow. I think Brazil is one of the largest exporters of commodities in Latin America, raw materials, soybeans, meat, and again, China, we see China as one of the big buyers of some of these commodities. We package a lot of products for customers in Brazil, shipping beef, shipping poultry, steel, going into China. And we are also looking at the opportunities related to maybe investments as interest rates start dropping, and Dr. Vieira also alluded to interest rates. We see people tending to make some longer-term investments, capital equipment investments. And I think that, again, from an opportunity standpoint, one of the things I see in Brazil, and we see as a company, is that Brazil has strong institutions. So even though we worry about the elections in 2010, and I did worry very much about Lula when Lula was elected. When Lula was elected, I thought it was over. And I've been very, very positively surprised. As a matter of fact, probably Lula was one of the presidents that really very smartly managed a lot of areas of politics in Brazil, not only the economy, but the relationships with the people, the relationships with the poor people, and I'm sure behind the scenes so Lula really surprised us. So strong institutions, I think, from what I hear from a lot of our customers and people in Brazil, are keeping Lula basically from making crazy mistakes like maybe friends in the north in Venezuela are making. And then finally, stable financial system. Again, I think Dr. Vieira alluded to that. I understand that maybe going forward, they're looking at making the central bank more independent, which I think that's going to be good for the country. Gives us more confidence that things are not going to change overnight with just one presidential election. So going forward for ITW, we will be looking at continuing to invest in the emerging markets, in the BRIC. All the business units are looking at growing. Our CEO has really a target to expand our businesses in areas that we have not traditionally been in. We have been a Midwest company, US, maybe European company, but going forward, a lot of these business units, the 800 plus business units with different products, packaging, welding, electronics, chemicals, are looking at expanding the business in these parts of the world that are growing very fast, and that present a significant opportunity for American companies like ours. So we will continue to invest in these economies, including Brazil. And I think because we're very decentralized, we will be looking at this on a business unit by business unit, and probably we'll be looking at it more as a way to grow the market domestically and not as an export platform, as other companies have done, like in China, for example. So with that, I conclude. I think I'm out of time, so thank you. Benita?
Thank you, Luis and Paulo. So with that, we'll open it up to questions from the audience. Please wait for a microphone to get to you. And also for the benefit of Paulo and Luis, please share your name and affiliation so that they have some context for the question. So any questions from the audience? David.
Yes, Paulo, as you mentioned, China is now Brazil's largest trading partner. That's mostly as a consequence of China's demand for iron ore and soybeans. Where do you see the relationship going? We had a trip to China with Lula several months ago. China's now announced a bilateral currency swap deal with Brazil for RMB, not just dollars. Could there someday be an FTA? Could there be someday a lot of Chinese investment in Brazil? And I've read that Brazilian manufacturers are actually quite concerned about Chinese competition. Will that fear get in the way of a stronger relationship?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. Thank you. You know, it's very interesting because if you look at what's been happening to export growth to the US, NAFTA, and Mercosur is down. Export growth to the European Union continues pretty well, and export growth to Asia is booming. Now, there's a very different composition of exports. Exports to NAFTA, the United States in particular, are primarily manufacturing, as are exports to the Mercosur, and Luis's firm would be one of those. Whereas exports to Asia are predominantly in the commodity space and in agribusinesses. And so it's quite clear that Brazil's competitiveness is increasingly in that area, and Brazil today has surpassed the United States as the world's largest exporter of food. So this is not a small thing. This is a really huge platform. And this encourages the trade with China and the complementarity of trade with China and India and so forth. But there is, as you alluded, this question of the manufacturing sector. And Brazil and China are, you know, I would expect to come at loggerheads on a lot of this, because this gives me the opportunity to mention something that Luiz mentioned, which is, you know, I mean, for those of us who have looked at Brazil's growth, and all of this debate is in Brazil, but it is really, to me, a shame that Brazil has not been able to make any further progress on competitiveness issues. And I think an FTA with China is feasible because both economies are very controlled, and would argue for some sort of a very minimal FTA. But in reality in Brazil, if you look since the mid-90s, nothing has been done in the area of trade. I mean, there's been a lot of discussion in the WTO, and Brazil took this attitude of a quid pro quo, that, you know, you need to get market access, and the big discussion is agriculture, and therefore it has not made any progress on any of the other areas. Now, to my mind, I can understand the political economy of this, but to my mind, that is a big gamble on, you know, suffering a loss of productivity all through these intermediate years in the hope of making a big bang later on. And as I said, I think that even in the business climate in Brazil today is pervasive in the sense that this is the right way to go. I don't think, you know, I mean, the protectionism in Brazil is with the laggards in the commercial, in the manufacturing sector. And the largest lobbying group in Brazil in business, which is Fiesp, the Federation of Industries of São Paulo, is a very strongly protectionist federation. I'm not very encouraged by what's going on, but at the same time, given the capacity of certain segments to produce very efficiently, and particularly in the agribusiness, that sustains a very favorable macro balance and a very favorable growth scenario, so that, you know, the perception that you really have to make some significant structural change in the area of competition policy is just simply not there. I mean, the idea is that you should go the way that it's going.
Question third row back, and then we'll move up to the right.
Thank you for your presentation. My name's Claire Meyer, and I'm with Allstate Investments. Both of you spoke about the central bank and interest rates. Going forward, what are your views on monetary policy and the possibility that in central bank independence, and if Morales leaves and pursues an elected position, what do you see the central bank looking like in a post-Morales period?
Paulo, you go ahead. You're
Okay. Yeah, I mean, first of all, as Luiz alluded, Lula was a surprise, and part of the Lula surprise is, if any one of you know, is Minister Palocci, and it was really unfortunate that he had to leave. I mean, many of these political figures, as we know, all over the world, they have these dual lives. But Palocci was an extraordinarily good Minister of Finance, and had a very clear, even though he's a doctor, not an economist, perhaps because of that, he had a very good conception of what to do. And so from the very start, and in fact to sort of try to prove the credentials, they really gave the central bank considerable operational autonomy. And to have invited Henrique Meirelles to be the governor of the central bank took a lot of oomph, because, you know, this is a man who, his previous job was running CSFB globally, right? So clearly his credentials were very clearly aligned. And this has worked very, very well. I don't think that there is, again, you know, Brazil is a very diverse political entity very strong federation, stronger even perhaps than the United States. That explains part of the tax difficulties. The way that the Congress is set up and the representation in Congress is such that I don't think that there will be any progress at all in the law making the central bank independent. I mean, it's a difficult law. Both of the candidates that are running for office for next year, the leading candidates, are against the law of the independence of the central bank. And that's part of the uncertainty that's there. But as I said, I think that, and I'm really deeply convinced of this, that, I mean, you would have to take someone who deliberately wants to break that system, to use all of his or her political influence as a president to break the system. So the system has an inertia that I think will continue, and that inertia is very positive. The staff of the central bank is very actively involved in the Monetary Policy Committee. I mean, this Monetary Policy Committee is a copy of the Bank of England. So the committee works on the basis of what the staff produces. The directors, of course, meet and decide, and they make the judgments on this. But they make the judgments on the basis of a fairly complex set of technical outputs. And the inflation targeting system is one where you're essentially managing expectations, and you're managing expectations on the basis of forecasts. So it's entirely a forecasting system. And so, that forecast is not done by the directors or by the president of the central bank. It's done by the staff. So the staff of the central bank is incredibly autonomous, because the only way you can get into the central bank, other than being one of the 7 directors or the president, is by taking an examination that is, usually there are like 5,000 or 6,000 applicants per position, and it is a very hard examination. And you have a completely insulated career. It has its positives and negatives, but nobody who works at the central bank hasn't been at the central bank and did not get in through this examination. And you can't fire them. So, it's not like they are, they may be individually have political sympathies, but their work is very much geared to the institution. So I think that there is a strong operational autonomy that comes from the traditions and from the way the central bank is run administratively, and not necessarily. Now, it matters a great deal who the president is and who the board is, of course. I don't think anything major is going to happen. I would have preferred if Henrique had, left the central bank when he joined the party. I know personally that was his idea. But of course, the crisis came in between, and it was very important and very fortunate that he was there at that time. So I think, under the circumstances, this is an understandable decision. I don't think anything will happen. I think that, as his political influence has grown, I'm convinced that he will be in control of this process of how the transition will be made. Probably it will be one of the internal directors that will assume the presidency of the bank. And as I said, I don't think there will be a discontinuity. Now, the market clearly is pricing a big issue, particularly over 2011. And that's because, one of the major opposition candidates who I used to work for, and I've personally known him for 40 years, he has this penchant to think that the central bank is terrible. I don't think he will do anything. But every time he opens his mouth, one of his favorite targets is to say how bad the central bank is.
A question in the second row.
Thank you very much for a fine panel. My name is Don Ziegler. I'm with the American Medical Association. And I wonder if you could speak just briefly about Brazil's energy and environmental policies as they relate to the economy and climate change.
Paulo, you again.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. I really don't, I'm not really capable of doing that. I know they're very complex, and I know that a common complaint is that the environmental protection laws in Brazil are delay projects, particularly in infrastructure. All I know is from reading the newspapers. I'm two-sided about that because I think, you need good laws. And, if they take a long time, well, you have to, But I really don't know.
From our side, from the manufacturing side, we see quite a bit of, first of all, on the energy side, there's a need for more energy infrastructure. And we've seen over the last couple of years things improving, but still, as the energy companies were privatized, but still there's more need for infrastructure. We see a lot of laws that are green laws. And throughout Brazil, you don't see the enforcement. The laws are very tough, but I don't think the enforcement is as tough. As companies like ours expand, the enforcement gets tougher for Western companies. So, for example, when we built our facility, we had to plant 5,000 trees. Now, you look around our facility, and there's informal companies going up that destroy the trees. So it's a little bit of a disconnect. Now there's smaller companies, but as I think as Brazil grows and the politicians become more sophisticated, they're going to slowly enforce some of these policies because it's good business to keep the communities clean and to not destroy some of the natural resources. So that's my perspective on that.
So we'll take a question all the way back in the left, and I'll just take a moment to interject my own question. We've touched on low levels of labor productivity, and we've touched on the informal economy, which is siphoning off talent, obviously. It's well known that there's a shortage of skilled labor, and so I guess either one of you to perhaps comment on the education system and some of the emphasis that might be placed as the government focused on this. To what extent will that be an impediment looking ahead to Brazil really achieving its full economic potential?
I'll give you my perspective from our own business standpoint. I think Dr. Vieira can give you a more global perspective. From our standpoint, when we're hiring people, it's very tough to hire good, qualified people. But when you find the good, qualified people, they're outstanding. And so I would say that Brazil, from a human resource standpoint, has very good professionals. They're not easy to find, and there's high demand for them. And as the demand heats up, we see their costs increasing and, again, becoming one of those Brazil costs. They have some very good schools, like Getúlio Vargas, some good engineering schools, and unfortunately, when you go into the outside of the communities, you don't see the same level of education. Even though Brazil is known to have free education for all, one of the things that you see, at least from my perspective, is a little bit of a self-perpetuating cycle where you have the people in the higher levels of society. They're able to probably get a better education as they go forward. They're able to take special classes. And when it comes time to go to college, they're probably a little bit at an advantage from the guy that came maybe from one of the slums because of so I think that over time maybe needs a little bit of tweaking. But that's my perspective. So Paulo, I don't know your perspective from a more macro.
Yeah, well, these are all big issues. I mean, we're touching on all the big issues in Brazil, and I think it's been a great accomplishment to have universal primary schooling, and this was achieved only less than 10 years ago, or 12 years, 13 years ago. So it's a recent accomplishment. However, the tests have shown that the quality of schooling is very poor. So the big challenge is to increase the quality, and so some of the tests, for example, found that the teachers that were teaching grade school were illiterate, so or functionally illiterate. So that's and of course there is huge variation across the countries. If you go to São Paulo State, you will probably find a very different level. So that's a big challenge, and this again goes back to the role of the public sector. I mean, it's an interesting system that, and one of the things that makes the Brazilian fiscal system complicated is that there are extensive earmarking of taxes, and so part of the earmarking goes to education, but at the federal level, all of that earmarking, which is about 20% of total taxes, goes to the university system. So the federal level, other than through grants, doesn't really support at all the primary and secondary schooling. That's the responsibility of municipalities and states. And it all goes to the universities. And the universities are autonomous, and as in many other aspects, and we touched about this, the whole labor law system in Brazil is fundamentally driven by a law and traditions of the 1930s that imported Mussolini's Carta del Lavoro. It's a corporatist system, and it works in Brazil, and you still have exactly that corporatist systems where you have national syndicates, local syndicates, state level and local syndicates that are organized by employers and by employees. And that's why if you make an agreement, it has to cut all the way across, and then the state comes in. Now, this system works very well in Austria to this day. So it's not that corporatism itself hasn't worked, but in Brazil it has its enormous costs. And the universities, I used to teach, at university, at a federal university in Rio de Janeiro. It's a problem. They are a problem. There are excellent universities, but there are some very bad universities. And the system doesn't seem to be able to differentiate between them. So if you teach in the federal university of now there is one in the state of Amapá, you get paid as much as if you teach in the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, but obviously you don't necessarily produce the same, or you don't have the same number of students and the same number of obligations. So this is it's very inefficient. There is a lot of spending. Brazil spends about 6 to 7% of GDP in public support to education, so it's not small by international comparisons. But what you get for that money is very little. You get very little. And so, as Luiz said, the private sector picks up the slack, and with the exception of some centers of excellence like USP, which is ranked among the top 30 or 40 universities in the world, you have very few of these, and a big challenge going forward is how to use all of the money that is already there and all of the resources that are already there so that you deliver better outputs. It's not a problem with the inputs.
Thanks so much for this presentation this morning. I'm Mike Tobin from Vantage Leadership Consulting. Luiz, I was wondering if you could comment on the cost and the risk of security in doing business in Brazil, and whether or not it is improving, and with the public attention on the Olympics, whether or not you anticipate it improving over time.
Well, in terms of cost and risks, I think that as Brazil has modernized, the risk of doing business in Brazil, from my perspective, has gone down. Now, as the risk has gone down, the cost to invest in these industries has gone up. So if I were to look at what it would cost us to set up a company like we have today versus maybe 8, 10 years ago, it would be a lot more expensive to set up today. Now, that would be from an investment standpoint. If you look at it from the standpoint of setting up a business and finding the right talent, that part is, and you understand you're from a talent management company, that's a process that takes time. When we set up our business, we hired a pool of people, both at the managerial level, plant level, and we had to churn them over for maybe a year or two until we found the right people, and we were able to train them in the right manner to be able to move the business forward. When you look at the risk in terms of like informal competition, I see that as something that's slowly going away. I don't know if it's all going to go away. I mean, Dr. Vieira mentioned that the federal system is very strong, and all these states have their different taxes, high value-added taxes, and I think as long as that exists, there's going to be all this informality, and that's a risk for businesses that go in and play by the rules, because there's people that don't play by the rules, and when you don't play by the rules, there's huge differences, 15, 20% difference. Bureaucracy is an issue. You have to deal with that while you're in Brazil. It's part of the cost of Brazil. And if you're going to set up a company in Brazil, you need to be very well supported by legal people, good legal people that guide you along the way, and also be supported by good people from a accounting standpoint, because you don't want to make mistakes in those areas. Otherwise, it's going to be costly going forward.
Excuse me, what about physical security? Are the costs of physical security going down, or are they going up?
In terms of security, I think that there are, from my perspective, there are two different types of securities that I worry about when I travel throughout the emerging markets. One is the security, the personal security of being robbed, mugged, and I think that has not improved in the years that I've been going to Brazil. But that is also true in many other parts of the world, in many big cities. I think even in Chicago, in some parts of Chicago, we have those problems. The security, the security in terms of, for example, being kidnapped. It's not the same risk in Brazil as maybe it is in Mexico City, or as it used to be in Colombia 10 years ago. I traveled to Brazil, and we've taken our CEO with some of our people that are present here, and we've talked about, do we take security guards? I don't think it's necessary. So now, this is given our type of business. If you're transporting a high-value product in Brazil and you're transporting a truck that maybe carries a couple $100,000 worth of products, maybe you want to have some security. I feel like in Brazil, unless you're a target because people are looking at you as a valuable, maybe a commodity from a political standpoint, or maybe as a possible target to get a big ransom, and unless you're in those type of situations, the average industrialist probably doesn't have to worry a lot, or as much as in Mexico, as much as maybe in Colombia or other parts of the world. But the risk is there.
Other questions? Yes.
Good morning. My name is Michael Muth. I'm an international business consultant and writer. When I hear a phrase like insulated, large, closed economy, that's a little disconcerting. We prefer large, open economies. And I'd just like to know, well, first of all, I assume Brazil is wide open for foreign direct investment. Most governments are very aggressive about going after that these days. But how closed and protective is the Brazilian economy, and what are the prospects for it opening up in the future?
Paulo, you want to tackle that? I'll give them my perspective on some of the industries I deal with.
Why don't you start? That's probably more valuable.
From our perspective, we see a lot of protectionism for local industry. And in a way, the government seems to be very paternalistic in that sense. I think there are some lobbying groups that lobby highly for duties. One of them is the steel group. They were open to imports of steel into Brazil maybe 2 years ago, and as the steel prices started to go down around the world and imports started to come in from China, from Korea, all of a sudden, magically, the duties went up. So these groups are very, have good power with the government, very influential. As a result, these prices of these commodities in Brazil are higher than they are in other parts of the world, and that makes Brazil uncompetitive in some of these products. When you look at, for example, importing products, importing steel, you have duties on the steel, but what you see other companies doing now is maybe they're importing some of the finished products. They can't get the steel, but maybe they get the door or the handle from China, and in a way they end up getting around that. So business is very creative around trying to maybe find the loopholes for some of these taxes, but overall it's a very protectionist environment, country. And has it worked well for Brazil? I think that some industries have benefited because they've been able to charge more for their products than they would normally charge outside. I think long term, they're not benefiting in the sense that maybe they're not taking out some of those inefficiencies that Dr. Vieira alluded to. You get used to charging high prices, you don't have to make the tough decisions. And I think long term, that's not going to be good for Brazil. Short term, maybe yes, but long term, I don't think so.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that's an interesting question. I mean, the United States is a large closed economy. Is that good or bad? You know, at the time when consumption was fueling growth, that was very good. At the time when consumption is not going to fuel growth, probably the alternative, one of the alternatives for the U.S. is to become a net export economy. Now, Brazil is a large closed economy, and it has a very large domestic consumption market. And as Luiz just said, he went to Brazil to supply primarily the domestic market. And it's one of the largest markets in the world. In consumption terms, I would say it's probably on the top 4 or 5 largest markets in the world. So that is a huge attraction. And it is a statistical factor. It's not necessarily, you know, so I don't think it's easy to say it's good or bad. Now, what is a reality is that Brazil's process of industrialization was based on import substitution. And that long period of import substitution that really began during the Great Depression and lasted pretty much until the 70s, really created a very distorted production structure that on the one hand, because of the large size, was not as inefficient as, say, import substitution was in Chile or in Korea in its earlier phases. So, you know, and it developed a very complex structure of production, a very full input-output matrix, which is what makes many business people in Brazil, and you know, perhaps correctly, to think of Brazil as a pole in the global economy, that Brazil is one of these few countries that really can be a pole, and not a country that is, you know, used as a platform or something like that. But that tension of trying to see Brazil as a global power in manufacturing and in services, and Brazil exports a lot of services increasingly. I mean, there's an enormous amount of development in biotechnology, software, engineering. Brazil is a leading exporter in these areas. So there is a tension between this idea that you can make the country one of the big countries in the world and develop, therefore try to protect, have your own multinationals. I mean, for example, the current regime, the current administration very much believes in that and uses the state, the National Development Bank, to foster Brazilian multinationals. And there are some very large Brazilian multinationals. And a model which is the more liberal in the British sense, you know, competitive, open economy. Now, in the past, the excesses all went to the protectionist side. But as I said, there have been some important opening up. And with Brazil today, the foreign direct investment regime is fully open, pretty much. In the central bank, while I was there, we took away all of the last foreign exchange restrictions. And so, in fact, in this debate today about the strengths of the currency, in terms of the norms of what the IMF calls the exchange agreements, the real is a conversible currency. There are no restrictions on, you know, you can import, export real, you can do transactions in real, before you couldn't do that. You couldn't, for example, export in reais. Now you can export in reais, you can import in reais, all of that. So all of that, but de facto, Brazil is not seen as a convertible, the real is not seen because there are a number of other restrictions. These restrictions operate, as Luiz said, at the sector level, at the industry level, and there are a variety of norms and regulations about pension funds, about mutual funds, about, but these is part of a long tradition in Brazil that I think is slowly changing in the right direction of making it a much more competitive economy. And as Luiz said, I think this comes endogenously from the very fortunate thing that Brazil has a very, very strong private sector and a very entrepreneurial private sector and pushes the envelope all the time. Do I think it's happening fast enough? No. I mean, I would wish that it could be happening faster. And I would think that Brazil would gain globally from doing unilateral trade liberalization. But that is not in the agenda. That was in the agenda, 10 years ago. It's no longer in the agenda. So that's the reality.
We have one last question, yes. One more. If you could just wait one moment, Janet will get you a microphone.
Good morning. My name is Miguel Liman, Trade Commissioner of Mexico. It's a question for Luis. Your concerns about violence in Mexico are actually, your concerns about Mexico are based on actual instances or just perceptions?
In terms of
The security concerns.
in terms of security, Miguel Angel, I think we've had people traveling to Mexico over the last 20 years, and the level of noise that I've heard has gone up. Now, we haven't fortunately experienced anything in our company that makes us feel, or we haven't had any incident within our company that I know of. But just the level of noise has gone up. I think as I guess the drug wars have intensified, maybe also there's a lot more covered in the newspapers, and maybe that makes it feel like it's a higher level. I don't know, but I think that when you compare maybe Mexico and Brazil, the issues are maybe a little different. So I don't know if that's.
So with that, I'd like to thank Paulo and Luis for sharing their insights, time, and expertise with us this morning. I think we'd all agree that it was highly beneficial. I'd also like to invite all of you to please provide the feedback that you were asked for when you came to the program this morning. That would be very beneficial as well. And please join me in thanking again Paulo and Luis.